Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to a bit of a different video, bit of a departure from the norm. But I wanted to make a video talking about the carries that are getting the biggest benefits from all of the upcoming changes in the next patch. We have obviously Durin's release, who's a pretty versatile support that'll end up seeing a lot of play in a bunch of different teams. But we also have the witch buffs that are going to affect a lot of other characters as well, and a bunch of teams that don't use Durin. And so I figured, you know what, we're getting some pretty major meta changes as a result of all of that, so let's talk about them. Before I get into any of the actual characters themselves, I want to explain why I wanted to make this video. I think generally when it comes to endgame stuff, when it comes to Stygian, when you have the characters that are getting shilled, pretty much no matter how good or bad they are, Fearless won't be a problem for you. But a lot of the time, you won't have the characters that are getting shilled because it's difficult to go for every single character that gets shilled on every Stygian Onslaught. And so, I've been looking a lot at what sort of teams are able to clear content even when they're not the teams getting shilled. And something I've noticed a lot in my testing in general is that, as a general rule, if characters have some teams that are getting at around 100k-ish DPS at KQM standard, either a tiny little bit less or more than that, they tend to be able to brute force a bunch of bosses, even ones that aren't necessarily shilled for them. And because we're getting a lot of major meta changes from next patch, I thought it was worth talking about the carries that before kind of struggled to get to that benchmark of being able to brute force stuff that isn't necessarily designed for them, and after the patch will be able to brute force stuff a lot more easily with their new teams or their old teams that got buffed or whatever. Before we get started on the 5 characters, I want to give a few honorable mentions to 3 different characters who are also getting some pretty big buffs from the upcoming changes, but where the buffs aren't enough to really change what my perception of their overall status in the meta is. First, Varesa. Varesa is already able to clear stuff. The new Varesa teams that she gets with Durin are about as good as, like, spin-optimized Mawika teams, but because most people don't play spin-optimized Mawika and Varesa teams, and also because people who try to actually clear Fearless generally have their investment above KQM standard. Investment above KQM standard tends to favor teams where the damage profile focuses more of the damage into one character. It tends to favor hyper carries a bit more, which means that teams that have their damage kind of split like 60-40 between a carry and a support at very high investment don't tend to perform as well as teams where more of the damage is focused into one character. So Durin's release is gonna help Varesa's teams in that way by concentrating more of the damage into her and making it so that a lot more people will be able to get those like really high performance over 120k DPS Varesa teams. But because she can already get to those DPS numbers with Mawika right now, because even without Mawika, she still does generally get to the DPS benchmark required to be able to brute force things, even that aren't necessarily favoring her specifically. I don't think it really changes Varesa's place in the meta. The second character I want to talk about is Clorinde. And honestly, it's kind of a similar thing, although Clorinde struggles a little bit more to get to the DPS requirements to brute force things. If you are using Mawika, she does generally get there. And the biggest upgrade that Clorinde is getting from the patch is the ability to be able to get there without Mawika, which is really nice because a lot of people want to use Mawika as a carry somewhere else. But I don't think the increase is big enough in the non-Mawika teams to quite warrant a place with the 5 characters I've selected. Because honestly, she can kind of get there before the changes anyways. And the last honorable mention I want to talk about is Razor. With Razor, it's actually the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's not that he was already getting there, it's that even with the buffs, he's gonna struggle to get there. Now, Razor won't be bad after the buffs, I want to make that very clear, but like right now, there aren't that many carries that have teams that actually gets to above 100k at KQM standard without going for very like unreasonable and unrealistic assumptions. With the buffs, from what I've looked at, Razor is going to be a little bit south of 100k, so not quite 100k, but not too far behind. Honestly, I think you could very much make an argument to include Razor, but I wanted to have a round number. I wanted to have 5, 6 feels awkward, and Razor's overall performance is going to be worse than the other 5 I'm about to mention, so I decided to separate him. That being said, right, he is a witch carry that doesn't have a good set right now. So if we end up getting a witch set in 6.3, that might change. And I guess a dishonorable mention that I know people are going to be curious about, so I want to just get him out of the way as well. Venti. Next patch specifically has a Stygian Onslaught boss that is meant to shill Venti, so he's going to feel pretty good there. But he doesn't get anywhere close to the 100k-ish DPS that I think is a good benchmark to be able to declare that a character is like able to brute force stuff that isn't necessarily designed for them. But Venti did also get a very big buff. He got a whole ass new playstyle. If you try to play carry Venti right now, it's gonna be really, really, really bad. So he definitely got a big buff. But I think that outside of the one enemy that's gonna be designed for him, it doesn't really change my perception of him overall in the meta. I still wouldn't really recommend going for Venti as a carry. Anyways, let's now get into the 5 characters I've actually wanted to talk about. First off is gonna be Klee. And there's a big asterisk to Klee, unlike the other 4 characters, which is that Klee is a character that is available in the Constellation Selector, and I am assuming that you are getting Klee's C1 here. If you don't get Klee's C1, she's got similar problems as Razor, where she kind of just struggles to get to that DPS breakpoint required. Just keep in mind, I am talking about Klee C1. With the witch changes, even without Durin, Klee is getting some pretty solid teams, right? She got a direct buff that's very big, and you will often play her with Fischl, so you're getting the Fischl buff that you can capitalize on as well. Overall, it's gonna be pretty good. Right now, I don't think Klee is a character that is all that valuable. She is definitely not going to be able to brute force stuff in her current state, but with the buffs, I think she will be. And on top of that, while I do think that her best team is gonna be the one with Fischl, I don't think the Mona versions of Klee teams are going to be bad either, which means she will also have the flexibility of being able to slot in different elements in order to be able to brute force a larger variety of enemies. If there's an enemy that requires Hydro application to deal with their mechanics, kind of like how the Crab requires Hydro and Dendro to deal with its mechanics, or at the very least like Dendro and Anemo, the fact that Klee is going to have some actual good teams and a few different variations that can incorporate different elements is going to be really nice for her. And I do think that she actually, at C1, does get to the point where, if you like Klee, you want to have a build Klee, she'll be able to be used in a lot of Stygian Onslaught stuff to brute force content. Obviously, when I talk about brute forcing content, that doesn't mean you'll be able to do everything. You look at something like Sigurd, for example. Sigurd is very difficult to brute force because if you don't have Ascendant Gleam, he's got a lot of HP. I'm more so talking about like brute forcing Hera. Right now, for example, you can use Lyney to brute force Hera and play some Melt Lyney stuff, which is pretty cool. And like just characters that just have the DPS required to deal with enemies like the Operative. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to deal with every enemy, but if you have them built and you like actually use them, you'll be able to use them in a lot of your Stygian Onslaughts. I want to make it very clear though, 4 of the 5 characters I'm about to mention, I think are not worth going for, mainly from a meta perspective. If the main factor in your decision making for whether you want to go for characters or not is just how strong they are meta-wise, that 100k-ish DPS breakpoint, it's enough to brute force some things, but not everything, and it's noticeably behind characters like Mawika and Skirt. So they're still not characters I would necessarily recommend over others from a meta standpoint, but they are characters where if you like them, you can main them without having to feel like you're playing a shit character, basically. Right? You're not gonna need a top 1% build to be able to clear Fearless. Anyways, the next character I want to talk about after Klee is Chasca. Chasca right now kind of has teams that can brute force, but it's really hard to call it a Chasca team when it's just a Melt Mawika, and using Chasca is worse than using like almost anyone else. And outside of the Melt Mawika teams, Chasca's teams kind of struggle, honestly. She tends to have issues with uptime and synergies because a lot of the characters that offer things she wants have some sort of negative synergy with her. I think a good way to understand just how cooked Chasca's teammate options are right now is go to GC Sim, look up Chasca, sort by DPS, and look at the highest C0 teams. We've got VV Chasca on Fav. We can dismiss that. Then we have the actual Chasca, which is worse, with Melt Mawika still. Then another Mawika thing, and then another Mawika thing. And if we scroll to the highest non-Mawika things, we've got, ooh, Skirk. Wow. If we scroll to the highest non-Mawika or Skirk thing, you've got Escoffier. Escoffier, character who offers very little value in this team because you only have 2 characters for her passive. Let me actually straight up remove Mawika and Skirk. Right, so characters with awful synergy because half of their passive just doesn't work, like Escoffier. Chevreuse, because the 60% pyro damage buff is actually competitive. Things are real cooked for Chasca teams because she just has really bad synergy with a lot of the characters that provide things she would want. Durin is going to help her a lot. When it comes to Shred, Chasca doesn't have good options. She can't slot in Chilonin or a VV character without losing a bullet of her passive, which is a massive deal, so you don't want to do that. She herself can technically go VV, but it obviously reduces her personal damage a lot. And so having shredders that are actually good, that you can play in Chasca teams, like Durin, is a really big deal for her. From what I've looked at, there's actually quite a few Chasca teams that get to that 100k-ish or 100k plus benchmark. Mainly it's teams that use Durin plus you can use Fischl, you can use Inefa, you can use Eon-San. Generally, it tends to be a little bit more leaning towards the teams that have Pyro, Hydro, Electro, but you can technically do double Pyro with Hydro as well, or even double Pyro with Electro and just ditch the Hydro altogether. Chasca doesn't actually care that much about getting those transformative reactions because at most, technically, she could react up to 3 or up to 2 of her 4 elemental bullets. In practice, that never really happens, and it's generally 1 of her bullets. And in those overvape teams, the multiplier it's gonna be Pyro Vape, so it's times 1.5. So a quarter of your elemental bullets gets increased by 50%. Obviously a little bit more with the EM you get, but it's really not that big of a deal. And if you end up with characters that have better synergy that are not Hydro, right, you can use something like Durin, Bennett, Eon-San now. The fact we're getting a character that does something similar to what Chevreuse does in those teams, but that actually provides the shred without needing the elemental requirement is a massive deal for Chasca, who was so starved for good buffers that she used no shred Chevreuse. All of this to say, Chasca is getting some really nice alternatives to her teams now, which are going to be overall fairly strong. One thing you should keep in mind if you are going to be playing Chasca, her burst does not snapshot. The stats are calculated dynamically when the burst hits enemies, which means if you burst at the end of your rotation, since there's a pretty long travel time, very often your buffs are going to disappear by the time burst hits the enemies. Because of that, especially since you're now going to be potentially able to use Mona in her teams, and Mona makes it so that you end up with less uptime on your Bennett or Eon-San buff because you have to swap to Mona after them. There's going to be quite a few situations where if you do 4 charge attacks into a burst, the burst is a DPS loss because it extends your rotations, but it's not buffed by any of your buffs anymore. But even if you do 3 charge attacks into a burst, the Bennett or the Eon-San buff is going to fall off before the burst hits. One thing I realized recently is that if you do the burst before the last charge attack instead of after, so if you still do 3 charge attacks, but you do charge, charge, burst, charge, or charge, burst, charge, charge, or even burst, charge, 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 because there's no delay after charge attack animation for the damage to happen, unlike burst, you end up taking the same amount of time to do all of your actions, but all of your damage happens in the time you take because that extra delay between burst usage and burst damage is now being spent during that time instead of after. So I'm pretty sure you're going to be supposed to use Chasca's burst earlier into your rotations when you do that. Next up is going to be Lyney. Lyney's best teams right now are generally either Chevreuse teams or Farina teams. In Farina teams, you don't get that much value from his passive because a lot of your damage is going to be vaping, which isn't bad because obviously vaping is good. Vaping deals more damage, and the multiplier from vape tends to increase Lyney's damage more than his passive that triggers when you hit enemies affected by pyro. So vaping is still an upside, but the upside of vaping is not nearly as large for him as it is for other characters. And so despite Farina being in some of his best teams, it's really more because of a lack of particularly great teammates rather than vape being all that great on him. His other good teams tend to be overload teams, but overload teams on Lyney have a pretty big problem, and that problem is Bennett uptime. Lyney takes a while to do all the actions he wants to do, and his skill deals more damage if it's used later into your rotation, because you end up getting more stacks of the passive for the skill, right? Each charge attack or burst that you use gives him 1 stack, and each up to 5 stacks. At 5 stacks, his skill does more damage. So generally, the more you can delay your skill, the better. But if you delay too long, it can happen after Bennett Burst expires. And because it's really easy to get interrupted, being forced to stay inside Bennett Burst and dodge and lose some charge attacks because you're close to enemies, it's gonna make you lose Bennett uptime. It just feels kind of bad. And so, despite Lyney not getting a major upgrade to his team DPS from the patch, I still think he's one of the biggest beneficiaries of all of the things that are happening, because he's going to get teams that are, from what I've looked at, slightly better than the current teams with Bennett, but that do not have any sort of circle impact bullshit. Lyney, Fischl, Durin, Chevreurs, from what I've looked at, is actually slightly better than the current best Lyney teams, but you don't have any circle impact. You don't need to stay anywhere, which means you can just run away from enemies. You don't need to be close to them at all, which, one, well, you don't have Bennett uptime to deal with anymore, so if you're slightly slow on your execution, you don't just lose a full charge attack, you just get it a second later. But two, it's gonna be easier not to fuck up because you have more flexibility with your movement. In order to get the Fischl buff, you do need to weave in a normal attack to proc Fischl's C6 at least twice per rotation, but as long as you remember to do that, honestly, things are looking pretty good for Lyney's teams with Durin. If you want to have a shielder, you can also replace Fischl for Inefa. It'll be a little bit worse because you don't have the Fischl buff or the Fischl damage, and you are now getting less shred from Durin because you only have 1 witch instead of 2. But you can build fully Inefa and get non-insignificant overload damage, right? She triggers overload every hit she does, and you get a shield option that isn't that much worse in terms of damage. But yeah, so all in all, Lyney is making this list not necessarily because of a major increase to his high performance optimal numbers, but because of a small increase to those, paired with the fact that it'll actually be realistic to get them compared to the current teams. The second to last character I want to talk about is Kinich. Right now, Kinich's teams have kind of a big identity problem, which is that he kind of wants to be played with Emilie and or Maoika because he doesn't have enough buffers to just have 3 buff slots that synergize well with him. But if you play him with those characters, the buffers that are good for Kinich don't really buff the rest of your team. If you're playing Ion-san, you're not buffing Emilie's damage with the attack buff, and same for Bennett. On top of that, because Kinich's field time is generally pretty long, if you're using Maoika, even if you're using Emilie, you don't really have time to use their burst after Bennett or Ion-san burst without losing uptime on Kinich from Bennett or Ion-san. Because of that, it kind of feels bad to build Kinich teams, because you never really know what part of the team building you should be focused on. Durin's release is going to be really nice for him, because we're now getting a character that has some off-field damage, but also is the off-field pyro app required, and is a team-wide buff, because the Res Shred actually shreds the resistances of Dendro, but also pyro, and potentially, if you end up using Albedo, which is going to be one of the things you can do, Geo as well. Kinich, Lyney, and Chasca share an aspect here, which is that all 3 of them are pretty reliant on Durin in order to get the upscale they want. That's something that Klee is less reliant on because she's a witch character herself, so she can activate the buff when paired with Fischl, even without Durin. But just 2 witch character combinations that do not include Durin for Kinich, Lyney, and Chasca don't tend to be that great. But the last character on the list is a little bit different, because the main thing that makes the last character on this list get improvements from the patch is not a buff from Fischl, a buff from Durin, it is the buff to Mona. Mona's buff is massive. You now have basically full uptime unless you have really long field time on her Omen buff. And you're also getting an even bigger increase to reaction damage, which means that specifically reaction damage, that is vape reactions, is getting the 60 damage percent, the 15, or I guess 24 if she's off-field, reaction multiplier from her C1, the 80 EM from her C2, and potentially the 15 crit rate from the C4. For Pyro characters, the fact that Mona's Hydro application is pretty bad means that she kind of needs to be paired with a second Hydro to enable them properly. And because there's no second Hydro that's a witch, and because we don't have a witch that provides a major attack buff, Pyro carries don't tend to have the greatest synergy with Mona. They'll generally have to sacrifice their attack buffing slot in order to still be vape carries with Mona. But Hydro carries do not. When we look at the current good Hydro carries, which are Mualani and Neuvillette, you're gonna notice they don't have any off-field Hydro, which means doing setups that activate support sets that require specific reactions, like VV, like Cinder City, tends to be really annoying with them. The fact that Mualani has some Hydro application, but the duration of it is too short to be helpful for Pyro carries, is actually really good for Hydro carries. Because if you open up your rotation with a Mona skill, then do the rest of your setup, and then back to Mona, burst, do the 4 normal attacks required for her full Omen extension. She will have caught her own particles, which helps her energy requirements, but you'll also have a Hydro aura on the enemy with your off-field Pyro ability deployed, which means you can then swap to your Shilonen or your Sucrose or whatever and swirl Hydro or crystallize Hydro, end up with no aura on the enemy, and then your Pyro starts hitting, so you can actually vape. Now, Neuvillette doesn't benefit from that too much, because his Hydro application is fairly high. Because of that, it's difficult to apply enough Pyro to keep up with him. But that's not the case for Mualani, which is the last character on this list. And oh boy, is she getting a major upgrade from this patch. Mualani gets to capitalize on pretty much every part of Mona's buffs, except the C4. Mualani having crit ascension and Mualani's best set being Codex means that it's very easy to overcap crit rate on her when you're including the 15 crit rate from Mona's C4. So she generally doesn't get full value from Mona's C4 and only ends up getting the equivalent of about 8-ish% crit rather than the full 15. But even then, because you're getting Hydro Resonance, 60 damage percent, 15 reaction damage, energy so you can Mualani burst every other rotation instead of every 3 rotations, EM, full VV uptime, because you're now swapping directly from your Animo to Mualani, which is something you cannot do without a second Hydro unit, because you would need to either, if your Pyro is deployed, the leftover Hydro from Mualani normal attack won't be enough to swirl, so you have to deploy your Pyro after you swirl, so you only get enough VV uptime for 2 bites right now. You'll now get all 3, or 2 plus bursts. Honestly, Mualani is really happy with these changes, and the team DPS for Mualani is going up by a lot. She is maybe the character that gets the biggest buff, and then on top of that, she was already a fairly strong character, and these buffs are enough to push her into the Mawika and Skirk range. How realistic will it be to get that? Well, it's still Mualani. Mualani still has a bunch of quality of life potential issues, but right now, the upside of all of those potential issues is DPS that at KQM standard is not all that amazing, but she does have good scaling with investment higher than KQM standard compared to other carries. So at high investment just from artifacts, she's fairly strong, though maybe not quite Skirk and Mawika level, but she does end up fairly close to like a character like Varesa, for example. And if you look at early constellations or signature, she's got some of the strongest in the game, so she does end up on a similar level to those. Now, oh boy, things are something. I still think Mualani is a very unforgiving character, so she's not someone I would necessarily recommend, but she actually will be able, honestly, she's gonna start being able to brute force content that counters her. But yeah, honestly, I don't want to talk about Mualani too much because I feel like I've already talked about Mualani a lot in the Mona witchcrafting video. You can refer to that if you want to know more about the synergies in the Mualani teams and what she's getting next patch. But overall, that's it for the characters that are getting the biggest meta changes with the buffs. At least from what I've looked at so far. It's possible I've missed things. Honestly, I'm kind of hoping I did, because the more stuff I've missed, the more things I'll have to test when the patch rolls around. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh to Venti and animal carries as a whole. I didn't include any of them because while Durin is a buff to them, it's not even close to enough to bring them to the sort of DPS that I think will be able to comfortably clear Fearless. I should also give an honorable mention to Sethos, actually. I didn't talk about Sethos because the only teams that I've found for Sethos that looked like they were really good were teams that do not run healers. Right, basically the same team as Clorinde. But Clorinde has self-healing, so not running a healer on her is fine. Not running a healer on Sethos is hell. Because pretty much all of Sethos' combos do not use any iframes throughout the whole combo. So dodging is going to be a pretty big DPS loss on him. And then on top of that, they're mechanically difficult, so it's going to require more focus to get good combos and cancels on Sethos, while also avoiding incoming attacks. But if you are the GOAT, I think there are actually some Sethos teams that do end up approaching that 100k DPS benchmark. I want to make it clear, the 5 characters I've talked about, and I guess the honorable mentions as well, I'm talking about them because they, in my opinion, are getting major changes to their overall meta placement. There are many great characters I haven't mentioned. I don't think Arlecchino is worse than Lyney or Klee, for example. I didn't mention Arlecchino because I think that Durin and just the witch buffs as a whole in Arlecchino teams tend to be side grades or very minor upgrades. I didn't mention Flynn's, despite both Durin and Yahoda adding more options to his teams, because it's really minor changes overall. Same for Nefer. I also didn't mention Neuvillette, because honestly, while Neuvillette does get a new team, he gets multiple new teams actually with Durin, they're all on a similar level to his current teams. I will say, the fact that we're getting Neuvillette teams that don't feel bad about running Pyro plus Dendro is going to be nice for certain enemies that just kind of suck to fight for Neuvillette teams right now, such as the Hera, although obviously Hera's going to be gone by the time Durin comes out, but it is going to give him a little bit more options. It's also going to potentially make him less reliant on Farina, because the value from the witch buff is going to be fairly high on a bunch of these characters, and that can potentially incentivize using last slot options that are either Mona, or a character like Albedo or Fischl that can give Neuvillette one more stack if you don't have his C1. Anyways, I don't want to get too into the all the details of all the meta changes. I'll be making, honestly, a bunch of videos next patch about all of the teams I'll be trying. So you can look forward to a lot of like less, I guess, structured videos next patch that just go over my experience, kind of like first impressions videos, but just on a bunch of different carries and their new teams. Let me know if you actually want to see that. Let me know in the comments of this video. As usual, that's going to be it for this one. Hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.